Hello and welcome to the latest in the series where we talk to Simon Presley from Propertyology. Always gives us a really interesting insight into the property market through some very, very good research. And we have in the past discussed with Simon the differences between cap cities and regions. And he's done an interesting study to look at Australia's oldest capital city and Australia's oldest regional city to see what we can learn about what's happened with property there over the last 20 years. He joins me once again. Simon, thanks again for your time.
Always good to chat, Kevin. Thanks for having me back.
It is always very interesting too. Let's have a look at this. We'll bring up the first graphic, which is headed up median house price. And firstly, you might like to tell us which two cities you've chosen.
Yeah, so our oldest capital city, obviously the first fleets are Sydney, and our oldest regional city is in the state of Tasmania, of course. That's Launceston, officially Australia's third oldest city overall and our oldest regional city. What both cities have in common, foundations is the convict era in both cases. Why we chose this case study, Kevin, is we often talk about capital city versus region, and Propertyology unapologetically frequently talks about regions primarily because no one else does. Not because we're anti-capital city, we're objective about all markets. But so we've looked at the last 20 years because we know that in an individual year in isolation, there's always going to be some good capital cities and some good regions. But over 20 years, this will surprise people. The property market of Launceston over that 20-year period has outperformed Sydney for 2 decades.
That surprises me straight up. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. The median, the average annual change in median house price in Sydney was 7.1% per annum over the last 20 years, which is spectacular growth. Launceston over that same 20-year period is 7.4%, so it beats it on a capital growth front. And then we look at the rental yield. In Sydney, the median house price or the median rental yield is 3.1%, and in Launceston it's 5.4%. So it doesn't matter how we want to carve the pie, whether we look at capital growth, whether we look at cash flow, or I believe both are important. You look at total return. Australia's oldest regional city has outperformed our oldest capital city. Fact.
Yeah. Okay, well, you can see the graph there and it tells its own story. You know, we can talk about that forever. Let's go to our second slide, which is, I think, you're having a look here at a property in the Launceston market.
Yes, I've got a vested interest and unashamedly, I personally invested in Launceston. It's about 18 months ago now. This is my own property. Why have we shown this? I guess it's for a couple of reasons. One to show we practice what we preach here in Propertyology, but also to show people the quality of home you get and compare it to the typical purchase price of what you might get in some expensive cities. So as you can see in that graphic, Kevin, I paid $375,000 for a character home, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, very close. It's positioned very close to Launceston's CBD. You can walk into the city to work, for example. So $375,000 over the last 18 months. Whilst our biggest cities lost about 20% in value, Launceston has grown by about 20% in value, and I've seen that firsthand with my own property there.
Wow, that's a tremendous demonstration. Thanks for sharing those with such a personal story. In your research, we'll go to our next slide now. Interesting also to look at population. Tell us what you see here.
Yeah,
it's pretty obvious, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess the second biggest myth in real estate is that population growth is the most important thing. The biggest myth is that the capital in capital city has something to do with capital growth. It doesn't, hence this case study. But looking at the population growth in each calendar year for Launceston and Sydney, ABS data goes back to 2002, so we've got the last 16 years here. The blue columns is Sydney's population growth rate, and the green is Launceston. You can see that pretty much every year Sydney's population growth rate has been higher than Launceston's, but I've just shared the evidence with you about what their property markets have done. So we've spoken before specifically about population growth, and yes, it does have an influence on property prices, but it has nowhere near the biggest influence on property prices. And here is one of many individual locations that we can show as a case study for that. If you look closely, where I've circled the green circle on the bottom right-hand corner of the chart there. Launceston's had 5 years where its population growth did nothing. There's 3 consecutive years, 2012, 13 and 14, when Tassie was actually in recession. Launceston lost a little bit of population in those years. In 2015, it was exactly 0 growth, and 2016, very, very small growth. Over that 16-year period from ABS data, Sydney's population has grown by 1.1 million people, and Launceston's has grown by 4,300 people. That's it.
Yeah.
And Sydney, what Launceston has seen in population growth in 16 years, Sydney will do in about 3 weeks.
Incredible. Yeah, staggering figures. Let's go to vacancy rates. Firstly, we'll have a look at Launceston.
Yeah, and the purpose of showing the vacancy rates, we're going to go through Launceston first and then Sydney. A misconception that some people have is, I guess it's the fear of the unknown, Kevin. They question, how am I going to get a tenant if I don't buy in a capital city? Well, the same way you'll get a tenant in a capital city is how you get a tenant in a regional location. But Launceston's vacancy period, we'll credit SQM here for this graphic. Their data goes back to 2005. So, we're talking 14 years of data. Launceston is no different to any other part of Australia. It has periods where vacancy rates are high, periods where it's low, and periods like the last few years, that green dotted line, where vacancy rates are, in the equilibrium stage. If we go now to the next graphic, is looking at same period of time, but for Greater Sydney's vacancy rates.
Yeah.
And you can see probably it started about 2017. And up to and including now, Sydney has an all-time record high vacancy rates. In Sydney's history, it's never experienced vacancy rates as high as what they are today, about 3.3%. But 3.3% of a big number, Sydney's population, over 5 million people. There's round figures. There's about 30,000 dwellings vacant in Sydney at the moment. All right. Now, lots of parties are being guilty from time to time of bagging a regional location for its high vacancy rates. Vacancy rates can be high, capital city or regional location at any particular point in time.
Yeah, well, that's you look at that growth. The growth in vacancies over that short period of time in Sydney, relatively, that's very steep. Just staying on that graph for a moment, on the side there, we're looking at 3.2. That is the vacancy percentage, is it?
Correct.
And on the other side are the numbers, yeah.
Numbers of dwellings, correct, yeah. And just a quick explanation for your viewers, Kevin, about Sydney's vacancy rates. It has come through and is still in the middle of it now, its biggest ever period for building construction. The biggest era in Sydney's history for building supply has unfolded over the last 5 years. And I guess partly why APRA got involved with credit so much over the last few years is because a very high portion of transactions in Sydney during its boom were property investors as opposed to owner-occupiers. So what that does from a vacancy rate point of view is someone who buys a property for investment purposes is adding extra stock to the rental pool. When that happens in large volumes, invariably it will result in high vacancy rates, which leads to rental prices easing and properties being emptier for longer than normal when they're between tenants.
Okay, we'll take you to our final graph now, and this is blue is Sydney, green is Launceston, and here we're looking at market performance since 1999.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, wrapping everything up together for our viewers, showing each individual calendar year for the 20-year period. As we mentioned earlier, Launceston has outperformed Sydney from a capital growth and a rental yield period, but we can see that over the 20-year period, there are times when Launceston has been stronger than Sydney. There are times when Sydney has been stronger than Launceston. And we'd see the same thing if we put any two locations side by side over 20 years. Interestingly, over that 20-year period, Sydney has had 5 calendar years where its median house price has declined in value. Launceston has had 3. Both locations have had booms. Both locations have had several years of not much growth. Both locations have had property market downturns. So the purpose of the case study here, Kevin, is to show a real life comparison of 2 different cities, highlighting why it is wrong to stereotype. Every market is capable of doing good things. Every market will have periods of poor performance. The misconception about region means risk. Our biggest capital city has had 5 calendar years of price declines. Our oldest regional city has had 3. When Launceston had its downturn, median house price declined by about $15,000. That's it. When Sydney had its most recent downturn, roughly a 2-year period, its median house price declined by about $150,000. People need to think about when they say risk, is it real risk or is it just perceived risk because of a lack of knowledge? And I suggest it's the latter.
Yeah, the other thing that strikes me about looking at this graph, it really shows the volatility of the Sydney market. You look at several years where the growth is okay and then very rapidly it goes into a negative, and it can just as easily jump out the next year when you think, well, maybe things are improving in Sydney, and then you look around at 2007, 2008 where it fell back again.
Yeah,
so it's very volatile.
And the cause of the volatility, Kevin, is the median house price is exceptionally high. So the more something's worth in tough times, the further it can fall. In most of these really affordable locations throughout Australia, and Launceston is just one of dozens and dozens of examples, when they have a downturn, yes, prices fall, but they don't necessarily crash if the median house price is already relatively affordable. You can buy a good quality house in Launceston today for around $400,000, in some cases a little bit less than that. When a market that is that affordable has a downturn, typically you just have several years of not much growth.
Wow, very good, mate. You bring us some tremendous information. Thank you, and this is no exception at all. Absolutely, mate. Thank you. Simon Presley, of course, from Propertyology, and a great website, and that's just a small example of some of the insights you can get if you're dealing with Simon and his team at Propertyology. Simon, thanks again, mate. Look forward to catching up again soon.
Good on you, Kevin. Have a great day, my friend.